This is the story about our American Revolution. British General Lord Cornwallis could not suppress the American rebellion in the South. Frustrated by losses at Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis moved his army north to Virginia in an effort to turn off the spigot of French aid that was helping fuel the American resistance. By establishing a military base of operations at Yorktown, Cornwallis could be reinforced by British Royal Navy supply ships, vessels that were soon engaged in a fierce naval battle off the Virginia Capes. While French and British ships battled for control of the Chesapeake Bay, Generals George Washington and Rochambeau were marching their troops and wagon trains south through Virginia to lay siege to Yorktown, entrapping Cornwallis and his entire army. This is the story of that march.
Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, where we explore what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. This series, retracing the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route through Virginia, is sponsored by the National Park Foundation and the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association, commonly referred to as W3R US. My name is Randy Flood, and I'll be your host through this journey. Today, we're in beautiful King and Queen Courthouse, Virginia, and we'll be talking with Dr. Robert Seelig, America's foremost expert in the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Flood, for introducing me here at King and Queen as we are making our way down to Yorktown. Now, you may be wondering why we are stopping here at King and Queen Courthouse. Well, one of the reasons is obviously that Rosson's Legion, on its way to Gloucester, which is just a couple miles down the road, also rode past this courthouse in September of 1781. But there's another reason why we're stopping here today, because it is a courthouse. Now, what is a courthouse? What's the function of a courthouse? This is where the laws of a country, of a county, of a state are kept. This is where the administration is. This is where you pay your taxes. This is where your land records are kept. Among the laws in Virginia, and not just in Virginia, but in all of the 13 states of the United States, in all of them, there's a law in the books that makes slavery legal, meaning it is legal for one person to own other persons. And at the courthouse today, I want to speak a little bit about that aspect of life in colonial and revolutionary and post-revolutionary United States until the Civil War, of course. How many African Americans are living in the United States in 1780 or 1781 during the Yorktown campaign? Well, in the United States, there are about 2.1 million white people and about 550,000 African Americans. So that's more than a quarter of the population. But most of African Americans, of course, live in the southern states, first and foremost in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where we have about 317, close to 320,000 white people and 220,000 African Americans. Almost half of the African Americans in the United States at the moment of its creation live here in Virginia. And for all practical purposes, all of them are enslaved. There are just a few, very small, couple thousand African Americans that are free. Now, what do they do during the war? What contribution do African Americans make to victory in 1781 and to American independence, of course, in 1783? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to look back a little bit and to the days before we have a continental army. Before we have a continental army, every state, every colony, pre-revolutionary America, every colony has a militia, and except for the state of Pennsylvania, which is dominated by Quakers, and they are pacifists. But all the other states have militia laws, and the militia law of Virginia, that is in effect during the War of Independence, states that let me quote what it says: all free male persons, hired servants and apprentices between the ages of 16 and 50 years shall be enrolled or formed into companies in the militia. That is important because sometimes you will hear somebody joined the militia. You cannot join the militia. If you meet the requirements, you're between 16 and 50 years old and a free male, you are in the militia, whether you like it or not. That's the one thing we need to remember. And the other is it says free white males. So free African Americans or free mulattoes, as it's called at that time, are in the militia, with the exception, of course, that they will not be serving under arms, but rather as drummers or fifers or doing handiwork, because even though they're in the militia, the Virginia legislature did not trust African Americans with guns. Now this is Virginia, and it's different in every state because that's a state law and regulations. It is from the militia, out of the militia, that the Continental Army recruits itself. It is out of the militia that the states draw men into their regiments, which then are part of the Continental Army. So theoretically and practically too, that means that free African Americans and free mulattoes that from Virginia can serve and do serve in the Virginia regiments in the Continental Army during the War of Independence. But that was not always that way. Remember during the Battle of Lexington and Concord in the spring of 1775, those were all volunteers who had rushed to Boston to fight against the British. Among them were a large number, or a sizable number at least, of African Americans, free African Americans. Now when Washington goes up to Boston to assume command of the Continental Army on the 15th of June 1775, one of the first things that Washington does is convene a meeting of all of his generals. And of course the question of African Americans in the Continental Army is raised at this meeting on the 9th of July 1775. And the general agreement that comes out of this meeting is that African Americans, Negroes as it is called, will not be allowed in the Continental Army. In other words, under the leadership of General Washington, who has just been appointed commanding officer of the Continental Army, the Continental Army is supposed to be a white army. That causes problems very quickly, of course, because there's had so many African Americans had served prior to the creation of the Continental Army who are now thrown out. And so very quickly Washington makes a turnaround together with the approval of his fellow generals, of course, and says African Americans who had been fighting for American independence before the creation of the Continental Army can re-enlist again. And so they re-enlist again. And as the year progresses, 1776 progresses, and the war becomes very obvious that this war is going to take a long time. We get to 1777, and in the spring of 1777, in January actually, the recruitment of free blacks is permitted as far as Washington, as far as Congress is concerned. As far as Congress is concerned, that doesn't mean that all the states will follow that permission. What happens in 1777, as we've heard before, The Continental Army cannot fill its ranks. Washington does not want short-term serving people. He wants people to serve for 3 years or for the duration of the war. And there's a manpower shortage. One of the consequences of this, as we heard, is that the Continental Army gets younger and younger. But the state of Rhode Island is in such dire straits as far as its strength of its regiments is concerned that the state of Rhode Island adopts what can only be called a desperate measure. In February of 1778, the legislature of Rhode Island passes a law that says that the state of Rhode Island will purchase African Americans from their masters if they pass muster and if they're healthy, etc., and will put them into the Rhode Island regiments. That is an emergency measure, an emergency legislation, because they see no other way out. And as a result of this, the state of Rhode Island does purchase the hundreds of African Americans to serve in the Rhode Island regiment. That this is an emergency measure is very obvious by the fact that this law is repealed a couple months later, because Rhode Island has all the soldiers that it needs. The Rhode Island Regiment, as we know, marches with Washington's army out of Westchester County in New York and accompanies the army all the way down to Yorktown. When the regiment marches through Philadelphia, there's a personnel record that shows that there are about 116 or so non-white soldiers in the Rhode Island Regiment. That's about a third of the total strength. They are, however, the regiment, however, is an integrated regiment, but meaning that whites and blacks and Native Americans serve in the regiment. However, the African Americans are segregated into two companies, the 6th and the 8th Company. That's where they serve. And that's how they accompany and journey down to Yorktown. But not all of them. What happens is that as the Rhode Island Regiment embarks on vessels to sail to Yorktown, from Plum Point at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, the regiment is ordered to line up. And a man by the name of Griffith shows up and says, I want to see who is in this regiment. Why does he do this? Because in 1778, when Sir William Howe had landed at the very same place where the Continental Army is now embarking to go to Virginia, his slave, Griffith, by the name of Griffith, had run away and had joined the British Army. Now on the way down to Yorktown, Mr. Griffith thinks this is his opportunity to get his slave back. And as they are lined up, he sees his slave. And the slave says, you are mine, get out of here. What do you think happens now with a black man who has served in the Rhode Island Regiment, wears the uniform of the United States? What is going to happen to him? He's given back to his owner. Property, it was his property. It was Mr. Griffith's property, and he wants his property back, and he gets his property back. Property rights are more important. Property rights is also one of the reasons probably why, not just probably, it's one of the reasons why neither side in the War of Independence really wants to touch the question of slavery, because slaves are the property of someone else, and you cannot take their property away. This is what the Declaration of Independence says: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Your property is sacred. Britain tries that. Lord Dunmore tries that in Virginia here when he issues a proclamation freeing slaves, but only the slaves of rebels, slaves of patriots who are fighting against Great Britain. He cannot free the slaves of loyalists, of people who are fighting with Great Britain, because it's their property, and the moment he takes their most valuable property away, they're probably going to switch sides to that side that actually protects their property. That's why Washington, the Congress, cannot liberate slaves and say you're all free. The whole War of Independence might collapse, the whole revolution might collapse. Sir Henry Clinton, in the British commander in New York, goes a step further in 1779 and issues a proclamation freeing all slaves, and more slaves do desert to the British than to the Americans, obviously. But in the long run, the number of African Americans fighting on either side does not make that much of a difference. It does not turn the tide of the war. So I said in the Rhode Island regiments are non-white soldiers. And among these non-white soldiers, what I mean by that, of course, is also Native Americans. Native Americans who also were enslaved in large numbers in the United States, not just in New England, but also in Georgia, the Carolinas, etc. In the Rhode Island Regiment, there are also Native Americans who fight for American independence, but there are others who also want to fight for American independence, or at least fight on the American side. These are mostly Native Americans from along the Mohawk River, Oneida, Tuscarora Indians or Native Americans who want to contribute. And they come to Philadelphia actually on the 1st and the 2nd of September of 1781, exactly as the Continental Army is marching through Philadelphia. That's about 40, 44, the numbers vary, mostly Oneida, who come to Philadelphia to ask for support for their families who are starving up there along the Mohawk River Valley. But they also would like to join the Continental Army on its march to Virginia, which they know about. When news of that reaches General Washington, that here are a dozen or more Native Americans who would like to join him on the march to Yorktown, General Washington is very hesitant about using them. As a matter of fact, if we are quite honest, he doesn't want them. In a letter to General Heath, Washington writes basically that Native Americans are not worth the effort. They're not worth the cost of having them in the army. He writes, in my answer to those chiefs, I have referred them to you, General Heath, and if you think they can be of any advantage, you may order them down. But it has ever been my opinion that their services never compensate the expense. That's the number of reasons for why Washington is so hesitant about using African Americans, but he likes to keep them at arm's length. Just like initially, he's very reluctant, as a matter of fact, opposed to using African Americans in the Continental Army. Maybe let's take a minute and quickly talk about African Americans, or rather Africans, with the French Army. How many are there? The simple answer is there's one. There's one African American, or one African from Madagascar by the name of Pandua, who is a musician in one of Rochambeau's regiments, who marches and travels to Yorktown with his regiment and back to New England again in 1782, and he deserts in Connecticut, and we do not know what happened to him or whether he had any children. There are others that do travel apparently with Rochambeau's army, because if you remember, I talked about pension applications being a valuable source for finding out about the War of Independence. And there is a pension application by a man by the name of Jacob Francis. And Jacob Francis writes in his pension application of 1829, Jacob Francis, a colored man, made solemn oath that he's now about 60 years of age, and that during the War of the Revolution he was a servant in the French army under the command of Rochambeau, that he was present at Little York in Virginia at the taking of Cornwallis, and although a boy of 12 or 13 years of age, he perfectly well remembers Edward Coleman, another colored man who was with him. Remember, we talked about how young the soldiers were. Here's another example of a 12 or a 13-year-old servant traveling with Rochambeau to Yorktown. But that doesn't mean there were more. He was not the only one, because just before the French forces leave Newport in June of 1781, there is what we have to call a slave auction in Newport. And at this slave auction, what is auctioned off are African Americans who had sailed out to a French fleet in March of 1781, thinking those were British vessels, because the French vessels were flying a British flag. They get on board these vessels of the French Navy, who is down here in an attempt to capture Benedict Arnold. They sail up to Newport, where they are put up for sale. General Rochambeau purchases himself a slave. Dr. Coss purchases himself a slave. Count Dillon, of whom we already have heard, purchase himself a male and a female slave, and the child that woman has with him, and other French officers do as well. There are French officers like Baron Closen, of whom we have heard already, who hires a free black man in Connecticut. His name is Peter, and Peter also travels with him all the way to Yorktown, back to Boston, and accompanies him to Germany in 1783 and lives with him in Germany. In other words, while African Americans or Africans are not present in large numbers in the French army on the way to Yorktown, African Americans also are connected, serve with, as servants, travel with the French army as well, and quite a few of them, as in the case of Dillon or Closen, actually go back to Europe with them. Thank you much.
Bob, thanks so much for your valuable insight into this historic community. To our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Join us in our next episode in Gloucester, Virginia. On behalf of the Real American Revolution, my name is Randy Flood. So long for now.